Joining me now, the Republican senator of Florida, author of the new book, An American Son, Marco Rubio. Senator, great to have you back on the program.
Thank you.
I want to start with what's on top of the news here. Yeah. The Arizona immigration law. As you know, critics say this is tantamount to racial profiling. Law enforcement has the ability to pull somebody over. If they think they're an illegal immigrant, they can demand their papers. Yeah. If the Supreme Court upholds that law, does that make you uncomfortable?
Well, and actually, I'm glad you asked me about that, because I grappled with this issue during my campaign, and I talked about it in the book that you just showed on screen there. When it was first introduced, it made me very uncomfortable. But then I learned more about what was happening. First of all, they made a slight change to it that specifically prohibited that sort of activity that you've outlined as a concern. And then I understood a little better about what Arizona faces and the unique aspects of Arizona as compared to, example, Florida. I mean, Arizona has a all-out border problem there that's not just about immigration. It's about security. And its legislature, frustrated with inaction from the federal level, reacted with this law. What I've said repeatedly is I believe Arizona has a right to pass that bill. I understand why they did it, but I don't think it's a national model, and I don't think other states should follow suit. For example, I don't want to see a law like that in Florida. But it's important to remind ourselves that what the Supreme Court analyzes is the constitutionality of the law. And I do believe that Arizona has a constitutional right to do this, but I think ultimately the blame for those kinds of laws falls on the shoulders of federal officials and the federal government for not doing its proper role in enforcing immigration laws.
Here's the big issue, and I know you grapple with this, you do in the book as well. We have up to 12 million illegal immigrants in the country. What are we going to do with those immigrants if we want to crack down on illegal immigration? In your view of the world, can any illegal immigrant become legal in the United States without first going home?
Well, again, that's the complexity of this issue. And what, as I outlined in the book, and I've talked about repeatedly in recent days, immigration is not a black or white issue. It's not a yes or no issue. It is complicated because it has a deep human element. These are human beings who find themselves here undocumented, but for the vast majority of them, they're here in search of a better life and opportunities for their children. On the other hand, the United States can't be the only country in the world that doesn't enforce its immigration laws. In fact, the United States today is the most generous country in the world on immigration. 1 million people a year come here illegally. Legally, there's no other country in the world that comes close to that. So your question goes to, what do we do with the folks that are here now?
All right, so what's the answer?
Well, the answer is threefold. Number one is we've got to win the confidence of the American people. It's a sequential approach. You can't just say we're going to deal with the 12 million people right up front. First, you've got to win the confidence of the American people that the federal government is serious about enforcing our immigration laws. And that's why I think border security and E-Verify are so important.
Well, deportations are up under President Obama. You said he's dropped the ball.
But it's not about just deportation. It's about enforcing the law. For example, an electronic verification system where employers have the security of knowing that the people they hire are legally here protects the American worker, and by the way, is good for the immigrants so they're not being exploited. Also, the border security element, which has improved. It has improved, but it needs to continue to improve. Then I think we need to modernize. The second step is to modernize our legal immigration system. One of the things we don't talk about enough is that, in my opinion, the single greatest contributor to illegal immigration is a broken legal immigration system. I think if you do those two things, then the plight of 12 million or 9 million or whatever the number is, it becomes easier to deal with. But look, it won't become easy. It'll never be easy, right, but it'll become easier if you have the confidence of the American people.
You get into these issues, as any legislator does, and it's the final step that's the hardest. Who can become legal? What is amnesty? And that's why this question is so crucial. Can anyone become legal who's here illegally without first going home?
Well, we've talked about, for example, in the case of the kids, and I began to work on an idea a few months ago that hopefully one day will be reality, and that is, what do you do, how do you accommodate kids that came here at a very young age, through no fault of their own, have grown up in this country, graduate high school, want to go to college and be a part of our future, and find themselves here undocumented through no fault of their own? And we began to create an approach, and we'll continue to work on an approach.
This is what's known as the DREAM Act.
Well, the DREAM Act I don't support. The DREAM Act is a different piece of legislation.
But it was your version of that legislation.
An alternative to it,
right,
which I've discussed since my campaign.
Right.
The need to accommodate these kids. But ultimately, again, here's where the balance comes into play. Yes, we need to be compassionate towards 9 or 12, whatever the number is, of people. These are human beings, and they are here because they're looking for a better life. But we also can't do anything that encourages illegal immigration in the future. And here's the other point that I think no one ever talks about. What about all these people, including many Latino, Hispanics, from Latin America, who are waiting to come here legally, who have done all the paperwork?
Senator, I understand
what do we say to them?
But
come
I still
illegally?
think I'm not able to get a definitive answer from you, which is, can anyone become legal without first going home? This is going to be the brass tacks question here when you get to immigration reform.
Yeah, but again, the answer to that question depends on the environment in which it's being answered. And in this current environment, the options that we have available today to deal with 12 million people is very limited because people are frustrated that our immigration laws are not being enforced, and we don't have a functional legal immigration system that people can avail themselves of, even if they did go back home.
The latest thing that's happened is that the president took action unilaterally. His Secretary of Homeland Security gave guidance to her local agencies saying there should be waivers, not necessarily a path to citizenship, but waivers for children of illegal immigrants. The president, speaking this week at a National Association of Latino elected and appointed officials, said this.
We should have passed the DREAM Act a long time ago. It was written by members of both parties. When it came up for a vote a year and a half ago, Republicans in Congress blocked it. The bill hadn't changed. The need hadn't changed. The only thing that had changed was politics.
And isn't the president right to this extent? You're not even comfortable saying what you would do about a path to citizenship for illegal immigrants who are here, even the children of illegal immigrants, because this is such a tough issue in the Republican Party over what is, quote unquote, amnesty.
Well, again, that's not an accurate assessment, because the first thing I would say is I have talked in specific about an approach for these kids. The DREAM Act is too broad. I said that repeatedly during my campaign. It doesn't just help the kids. It ultimately, in a very short order, could lead to these kids bringing in multiple relatives. It could lead to millions of other people immigrating through this process. It goes back to the balance that I talk about. We need to be compassionate, but we also can't do something that encourages illegal immigration in the future. And I think the DREAM Act, as they have written it, would do that.
But what the president did, you didn't like the way he did it. You wanted legislation. But substantively, you agree with what the president did.
Well, even substantively, it's a short-term fix for a long-term problem. And in fact, what it does is it injects election year politics into an issue that will never be solved as long as it's a political one. I am convinced after a year and a half here in Washington and in the Senate that for some people, I wouldn't say many or all, but for many, I would just say too many people, this issue is more valuable unresolved. For them, they'd rather have the immigration issue unresolved. Many of them on the left.
Bill. You had a chance to put forward the bill. You didn't advance the legislation. Why not force Democrats to vote on this?
Because
we're leading voice on immigration.
Well, first of all, we have developed the idea in enough detail that people knew what was in it, and we're able to. When I first announced the idea, immediately Democrats and the left criticized me. The same people who are now applauding the president for doing something similar. But so that exposes the hypocrisy behind it. The second point is that legislation like this, if you are a responsible policymaker, you don't just rush out a piece of legislation that impacts the lives of potentially 800,000 people, that deeply affects the immigration laws of this country. You have to be careful. You have to have answers to every question. If I rush out a piece of legislation that's not ready, if I don't have every answer to every question that's going to be raised about that bill, it loses credibility from the onset. So I will continue to approach it as a responsible policymaker. Look, if I wanted a talking point, if what I wanted was something to use in November elections, we would have cobbled something together and rolled it out.
But here's the reality. You support a candidate, Mitt Romney, who talked about self-deportation during the campaign, had to run hard to the right here on illegal immigration, had said at one point that he would veto the DREAM Act. And the reality is that he's far behind President Obama among Latino voters. You write this in your book, An American Son, about Canada. I begin to wonder if some of the people who speak so disparagingly about immigrants would be just as worked up if most of them were coming from Canada. You suggest a level of racism here toward illegal immigrants. How much of a problem does the Republican Party have on this issue?
Well, first of all, that assumes that all these voices are Republicans. The enormous, vast, and overwhelming majority of Republicans are supporters of legal immigration, are compassionate to the plight of legal immigrants, but understand that illegal immigrants, but understand that America cannot be the only country in the world that doesn't enforce its immigration laws. And by the way, again, I repeat, what about the 30, 40, 50 million people that are waiting to immigrate to the U.S., whose relatives come to my offices, for example, some of them, asking for help to expedite that process? What do I tell them? Come illegally, it's cheaper and quicker. So I think that no one talks about them. And this is, again, it's not a simple issue. And the DREAM Act is too broad. There is an alternative that's better. It's what we were working on, is what I had hoped to work on outside of politics, to be able to elevate the issue beyond the give and take of electoral politics. Obviously, that's not going to happen, unfortunately, this year, because now the issue has been politicized by the president.
But Romney's got a big disadvantage. You would agree with that among Latino voters?
Well, again, I think we need to remember that there are some historic factors in play. I mean, there are also a large number of Hispanic voters in this country who happen to be liberal Democrats, who happen to be lifelong Democrats. They're not going to change the position and decide to vote for Mitt Romney now because he'll change his position on immigration or not. So we need to realize that this is a long-term effort for the Republican Party to ensure that our message of limited government and free enterprise is accessible to a group of Americans that happen to be of Hispanic descent.